Welcome to The Debate. Today we are looking at the architects of the 20th century's most staggering loss of human life. We are doing a deep comparative, historical, and demographic analysis of Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill during the Second World War.
And it is an incredibly heavy topic.
It really is. The central question we are exploring today is this. When evaluating this unimaginable scale of destruction, does Hitler's obsession with biological eradication place him in a completely singular, unparalleled category of evil? Or do the massive death tolls of Stalin's state terror and the ruthless human cost of Churchill's imperial decisions demand a broader, more equivalent framework for how we assign historical culpability? I mean, determining who was the worst of these three is incredibly complex. They were all bad. Really, really bad.
Absolutely. And this isn't just a theoretical exercise. Our discourse today emerges directly from recent comparative historical scholarship, declassified post-Cold War archival data, and the actual unvarnished records of the British War Cabinet. In fact, having spent years researching this and writing 3 books covering World War II, the last days of Hitler, and the duplicity of Churchill, I can tell you that the archives paint a very different picture than the popular myths we all grew up with.
Exactly. And diving into those archives, my position today is that Hitler's unique intent, the fact that annihilation was his ultimate goal, along with the sheer, compressed velocity of his killing apparatus, isolates him as history's unparalleled architect of mass murder.
While I will be arguing that focusing exclusively on Hitler's ideology risks letting others off the hook, it can minimize the catastrophic, systemic slaughter orchestrated by Stalin, and it certainly obscures the devastating human cost of Churchill's strategic and colonial decisions. Acknowledging Hitler's profound evil is absolutely essential, of course, but history demands complexity rather than comfort.
Right. To set the baseline here, we really have to look at the empirical reality that came out of the post-Cold War archival consensus. For decades, during the Cold War, Western estimates suggested Stalin killed anywhere from 20 to 60 million people. But when the Soviet archives were finally declassified, demographers realized those figures were actually statistically impossible. The actual internal Soviet ledgers demonstrated deliberate death toll of 6 to 9 million non-combatants under Stalin.
Which is still a comprehensively staggering number.
Oh, it is staggering. But modern demography also demonstrates that Hitler's regime intentionally murdered 11 to 12 million non-combatants. So, right out of the gate, Hitler's deliberate death toll surpasses Stalin's. But what really isolates Hitler's regime is the velocity. He achieved this immense slaughter in a highly compressed time frame, primarily just between 1939 and 1945.
The speed is undeniable, yes?
But it is more than just speed, it is the fundamental nature of the violence. Hitler's violence was rooted in rigid biological determinism. The Holocaust, the hunger plan, the deliberate starvation of millions of Soviet prisoners of war, these weren't just terrible byproducts of a political struggle. The killing wasn't a means to an end, the killing was the end.
I come at it from a different way. Because focusing solely on that specific type of intent obscures the broader reality of state-sponsored catastrophe. When we look closely at Stalin's regime, those 6 to 9 million deliberate deaths you mentioned, we are looking at a bureaucratic machinery of death that fundamentally shattered societies. We are talking about the Holodomor, the completely engineered famine in Ukraine. We are talking about the ethnic deportations of Chechens and Crimean Tatars, and the sprawling normalized horror of the Gulag system.
I don't dispute the horror of the Gulag system, but the mechanism—
Let me just add the military aspect, if I may, because Stalin possessed a brutal disregard for his own soldiers' lives that is hard to even comprehend today. Look at Order 227. That was his famous not one step back directive. It literally established blocking detachments to shoot retreating Soviet personnel. He funneled nearly 500,000 of his own disgraced or captured soldiers into penal battalions and sent them on suicidal missions to clear minefields by just marching through them.
But this is where we have to unpack the difference between killing as a tool and killing as an end goal. Let's look at the metrics of mass murder here: intent versus scale. Stalin's violence, as brutal as it was,
was instrumental. It was used as a terrifying tool to enforce ideological conformity, to force rapid industrialization, and to eliminate perceived political threats.
And you think that distinction matters when we are evaluating culpability?
I think it fundamentally changes the typology of the horror. The victims of Nazi Germany were not political adversaries who could theoretically be intimidated, subjugated, or re-educated. They were entire ethnic and biological groups targeted for total extermination. If you look at General Plan Ost, the Nazi blueprint for Eastern Europe, the plan was the deliberate starvation and extermination of 45 to 60 million Slavs, assuming the Axis won. Let that number sink in for a second. 45 to 60 million. Hitler's demographic ambitions were artificially truncated only because he lost the actual shooting war.
I hear the distinction you're making between instrumental killing, killing for a political purpose, and eliminationist killing, where the death is the whole point. But I just do not buy that it places Hitler in a totally separate category of evil. Let me tell you why. That distinction offers absolutely zero comfort to the victims, and frankly, it risks sanitizing Stalin's bureaucratic terror. You mentioned that Hitler's violence was compressed into 6 years, whereas Stalin's spanned from 1924 to 1953. Spreading the slaughter out over 30 years doesn't make it less categorically evil. It makes it a permanent, normalized feature of the state.
It doesn't sanitize it to categorize it accurately. The velocity of the Nazi killing apparatus, murdering 12 million people in essentially 6 years, required a societal reorganization around death that is entirely unique.
But Stalin reorganized society around paranoia and death as well. He used fluid, entirely subjective justifications, like class warfare, to systematically liquidate millions. Look at the execution of 22,000 Polish officers at Katyn, or look at how he treated returning Soviet prisoners of war. This is one of the darkest chapters of the war. Millions of Soviet soldiers who actually survived the horrors of Nazi starvation camps finally made it home, only to be treated with intense suspicion. Stalin viewed them as ideologically contaminated simply because they had been captured.
It is a devastating historical reality.
Hundreds of thousands of those survivors were executed or sent directly into the frozen wastes of the Gulag. The sheer paranoia and the structural disregard for human life under Stalin cannot be relegated to some secondary status just because he wasn't using a biological or racial framework. He still built a machine designed to consume human beings.
I am certainly not suggesting Stalin's terror was secondary in its cruelty, but Hitler's unprovoked invasions initiated the actual, kinetic conflict that resulted in over 50 million total deaths across the continent. He was the prime mover of the catastrophe. However, you brought up the idea of the state treating human beings as disposable assets for a larger goal. This brings us to a really uncomfortable parallel when we look at Western leadership.
You're talking about Churchill?
Exactly. We have to contextualize Churchill and the crucible of 1940 to really understand his strategic choices. In May 1940, the French military is collapsing, the British army is trapped at Dunkirk, Lord Halifax, the foreign secretary, pushes intensely to explore peace terms with Hitler through Mussolini.
Right, the famous war cabinet crisis.
Yes, and Churchill's absolute refusal to accept that proposal was, frankly, a strategic masterstroke that saved European liberty. The war cabinet records show us exactly what Churchill understood. A negotiated peace was a total illusion. It would have required handing over naval bases and neutralizing the British military, effectively reducing Britain to a vassal state. Churchill essentially bankrupted the British Empire to keep fighting. He knew that any peace treaty with Hitler wasn't worth the paper it was printed on, and that the survival of a free Europe was fundamentally incompatible with the Nazi state.
That is the triumphant narrative, and it is a compelling one. But if we are analyzing the architects of demographic catastrophe, we have to look at the moral contradictions of Churchill's total war strategy. We have a leader who is universally lauded for fighting fascism in Europe, while simultaneously deploying fascistic colonial policies abroad.
I think fascistic might be conflating imperial neglect with intentional extermination, but go on.
Let's look at the reality on the ground in 1943, the Bengal famine. An estimated 3 million Indians starved to death. And this wasn't just a natural disaster. It was deeply exacerbated by British policy. When you read the war cabinet minutes from that period, it is chilling. Australian wheat ships are literally sailing past India to build up stockpiles in Ceylon and Europe.
But the context of those shipping lanes.
The context is that Churchill explicitly refused desperate requests from his own colonial officials to divert vital shipping to relieve the famine. He didn't just refuse, he dismissed the crisis with openly racist rhetoric. He complained that Indians were breeding like rabbits and callously asked his officials why, if the famine was so bad, Mahatma Gandhi was not yet dead. This imperial calculus treated 3 million Indian lives as entirely secondary to British post-war security.
The rhetoric was undeniable and deplorable. Churchill held deeply Victorian racist views regarding India, and the Bengal famine was a profound failure of colonial administration. But we have to look at the global logistical constraints in 1943 before we equate this to Stalin's engineered famines. The Battle of the Atlantic was raging. Japanese submarines were heavily active in the Indian Ocean, severely limiting merchant shipping.
The ships were there. They were just prioritized for European stockpiles.
Because vessels were desperately required to supply the impending Allied invasions of Sicily and Italy. It was a brutal triage of global war. And it is a matter of archival record that once the sheer scale of the Bengal famine fully penetrated the war cabinet's immediate priorities, over 1 million tons of grain were eventually shipped to the region in 1944. That is fundamentally different from Stalin actively sealing the borders of Ukraine to ensure millions starved during the Holodomor.
I think telling the families of 3 million starved colonial subjects that their deaths were a brutal triage highlights exactly why Churchill belongs in this comparative framework. But let's move from colonial policy to his military strategy in Europe. Churchill enthusiastically supported the strategic area bombing of German cities. We aren't just talking about hitting factories. The explicit doctrine was to target worker housing, to shatter civilian morale.
The bombing of cities like Dresden or Hamburg was horrific. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died.
Around 500,000 German civilians in total. And tied to that is Churchill's rigid adherence to the doctrine of unconditional surrender. By demanding the complete humiliating destruction of the German state, you could argue he unnecessarily prolonged the war, trapping the German resistance and costing millions of additional lives. If we are judging leaders by the ruthless human cost of their calculus, Churchill's willingness to sacrifice millions to completely ruin the German nation has to be heavily scrutinized.
I have to push back on the idea that unconditional surrender was just punitive imperial hubris. That doctrine, formulated with Roosevelt at Casablanca, was a grim but absolutely necessary military imperative. It was a vital political signal to Stalin.
To keep the Soviets fighting.
Exactly. The Grand Alliance was incredibly fragile. Churchill and Roosevelt were terrified Stalin might negotiate a separate peace with Hitler, just like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Unconditional surrender assured Stalin that the West would not leave the Soviets to fight Germany alone. And regarding the area bombing, yes, it was devastating. But those German cities were producing the material enabling the Holocaust and the slaughter on the Eastern Front. Destroying the infrastructure and the workforce of the Nazi regime was deemed the absolute fastest way to shatter a war machine that was actively exterminating thousands of people every single day.
But at what cost to the potential internal collapse of Germany? We actually know from declassified interrogations of the German officers involved in the July 1944 plot, the famous attempt to assassinate Hitler, that the unconditional surrender policy completely paralyzed the German resistance.
You're referring to the military conspirators.
Right. Field Marshal von Witzleben and his network. They explicitly cited the Allied demand for unconditional surrender as the reason military support for their coup faltered. The generals believed they had no honorable exit, no chance to negotiate a post-Hitler peace, so they kept fighting. That extended the war by months, which translates to millions of additional dead in the camps and on the front lines.
Which brings us to a really fascinating aspect of this entire historical analysis, which is the weaponization of history and memory. How we remember these decisions and how these leaders intentionally shaped their own legacies. Because we are still untangling these narratives today.
Oh, absolutely. All three of these men were acutely aware of history, and they actively manufactured their own mythology.
Let's talk about the absurdity of the mythology surrounding Hitler's death, because the archive shed an incredible light on this. As you noted in your writings on Hitler's final days, the evidence unequivocally proves that Hitler died an ordinary, squalid suicide in a bunker on April 30, 1945. His aides dragged his body into a muddy crater in the Chancellery Garden and inadequately cremated it. When Soviet forensic teams took the grounds, they recovered his dental remains.
And this wasn't guesswork.
Not at all. Think about how wild that is. We had the exact dental records. They found a 975 fine gold bridge that was definitively identified by Kathy Hauserman, who was Hitler's own dental assistant. They had hard forensic proof of his pathetic end. Yet just a few months later at the Potsdam Conference, Stalin deliberately looked Truman and Churchill in the eye and invented a ghost story. He falsely suggested Hitler had escaped to Spain or Argentina.
It is one of the most brazen lies of the 20th century.
Stalin weaponized that uncertainty purely for Cold War geopolitical leverage. He created a deliberate disinformation campaign, silenced his own Soviet forensic experts, and used Hitler's ghost to justify keeping a massive military presence in Eastern Europe. That single lie allowed conspiracy theories to flourish for decades.
And Stalin's deception served a brilliant, terrible dual purpose. It kept the West completely off balance, and it explicitly prevented Hitler's death from offering any psychological closure to the world. But if we are going to rigorously critique how memory was manipulated, we have to look at Churchill's duplicity as well.
Fair enough.
Churchill literally wrote a 6-volume history of the Second World War, and he didn't do it just for posterity. He did it to ensure that history judged him as the flawless savior of the West. He famously quipped that history would be kind to him because he intended to write it, and he did. He successfully smoothed over the intense, bitter, near collapse of the war cabinet debates, and more importantly, he practically erased his devastating colonial record, like the Bengal famine, from the triumphant narrative of Western liberation.
He certainly centered himself as the indispensable man of the century.
Right. And I think this touches on why these myths persist, whether it is Soviet disinformation about Hitler's escape, or British historical framing of Churchill as a spotless hero, or the modern tendency to view Hitler as some sort of supernatural cartoon villain. We seem to share this deep psychological need to distance ourselves from the reality of their human nature.
That is a profoundly important point. By casting Hitler as an otherworldly demon or a supernatural evil genius, we avoid the terrifying truth that he was just an ordinary, deeply flawed human being. He was a politician who made choices that millions of other ordinary people willingly enabled, bureaucratized, and executed.
Exactly. When we strip these historical figures of their ordinary humanity, whether we are mythologizing Churchill as a flawless bastion of good or reducing Hitler to a pure abstraction of evil, we create a very comfortable distance. It prevents us from understanding the true, mundane, administrative nature of human atrocity.
I think we completely align on that assessment. The reality is that the architects of the most staggering suffering in human history were not supernatural forces. They were men in suits and uniforms sitting around tables making strategic, logistical, and bureaucratic decisions. And when you actually sit down and read the post-Cold War archives, what becomes terrifyingly clear is the methodical, administrative nature of the violence.
It is the paperwork of death.
Exactly. But to summarize my position in light of our discussion today, while I deeply acknowledge the horrifying scale of Stalin's state terror and the ruthless, often devastating calculations of Churchill's wartime leadership, I maintain that the empirical evidence isolates Hitler. The velocity is unmatched. The fact that the Nazi regime murdered 11 to 12 million non-combatants in just 6 years, driven entirely by a rigid biological obsession with extermination, places Hitler in a totally unique category of historical horror. For Hitler, violence was not a means to an end. Annihilation was the end itself, a goal that was only stopped by the total military destruction of his regime.
And to summarize my perspective, acknowledging Hitler's uniqueness must never be used to sanitize or compartmentalize the massive slaughters of Stalin, nor the devastating imperial calculations of Churchill. Stalin's bureaucratic machinery of death consumed millions over decades, backed by a paranoia that treated his own citizens and his own soldiers as entirely disposable assets. And Churchill's leadership, while absolutely indispensable to the defeat of fascism in Europe, simultaneously authorized policies that resulted in mass civilian casualties, from the firebombing of Germany to the preventable starvation of millions in Bengal. History demands complexity rather than comfort. Weighing the catastrophic legacies of these three men requires us to look unflinchingly at how totalizing state power and imperial preservation yields human suffering on an almost incomprehensible scale.
It is clear that while we weigh the metrics of intent, scale, and strategic necessity very differently, we have found a strong point of convergence today. The greatest danger lies in mythologizing these historical figures. Stripping them of their humanity creates a dangerous illusion that evil is easily recognizable or that it is entirely foreign to normal political structures. As we have seen from the declassified archives, from the buried Soviet dental forensics to the heavily sanitized British War Cabinet minutes, the truth is far more complex and far more challenging than the narratives we have been handed.
Indeed. The archives continue to yield insights that force us to reevaluate these comfortable histories. Understanding these figures in their full, unvarnished complexity is really the only way we can genuinely comprehend the massive historical catastrophes they orchestrated.
There is still so much more to explore in the historical material regarding how we remember the architects of the 20th century. Thank you for joining us on The Debate. We leave it to you, the listener, to form your own conclusions about how history should weigh these catastrophic legacies.